Bonjour à tous. Hi, everyone. Guten Tag, dear colleagues and friends. My name is Philippe Bourque, and I am a first-year doctorate student at McGill University. And today, I'm sharing my presentation in the context of a seminar I took at McGill called Large Vocal Forms, taught by Dr. Jean-Sébastien Vallée. I am here today to discuss the 6 narrative works by German composer Heinrich Schütz. I actually wrote a paper on these works, but I am now presenting the content of that paper with salient music and audio examples. But first, before we get into those 6 works, I would like to share with you a little bit about the life of the composer and have a few key pointers. We forget, but Schütz is actually the most important composer of Germany before Johann Sebastian Bach. He has a very, very large and diversified compositional output. And that can be explained partly from the fact that he had a very long life. He lives 87 years, and he published many of his works during his life. Another important fact is that he studied with Gabrieli and Monteverdi. He's going to go twice to Italy, and we'll come back to that fact, out of which he learned the Seconda Pratica and the Venetian style. A quick comparison that is interesting. Schütz was born 100 years before Bach, and as much as we think of Bach with Leipzig, where he was a Kapellmeister for 27 years, we must look at Schütz, who was associated with the Dresden court, the Catholic Dresden court, where he was Kapellmeister for nothing less than 55 years until his death. Schütz was a Lutheran, but I'm saying that the court was Catholic mainly for political reasons. Speaking of the Dresden court, you have now a picture of the palace chapel where Schütz was teaching, composing, and of course performing a lot of works for the court. One interesting thing as well about his life is that he was able to travel, particularly to Copenhagen, and he went to different places in Europe, and he could take extensive stays in those countries. For example, in Copenhagen, he will be composing residence for many months. So we're talking quite big trips here. He was allowed as well to compose for other courts. He was surrounded by aristocracies for all of his life, and often they will require his services for funerals, but especially for weddings. He survived the very bloody 30 Years' War in Europe, and this is an important point because this war will have significant consequences on the choir and orchestra of the court. He will come back to the chapel after his many trips to find the choir in shambles. Another important thing is that financially, because of the 30 Years' War, the court was obviously into debt from those for political and for military reasons. And a lot of the singers and instrumentalists at the court were not paid. And not paid, I mean, forget about unions, they were not paid for almost years sometimes. So it was difficult for him to recruit and to have a stable choir and orchestra. Many times he had to rebuild it. Now, if we look at the 6 narrative works, the first one will be, fairly early midlife. And then the next 5 will be much later in his life. The first 3, the Resurrection Oratorio, the 7 words of Jesus on the cross, and the Christmas Oratorio, as you can hear, are more linked to the oratorio style. We're going to see they have a different name, though, given by the composer. And the latter 3 here are closer to what we call the Passion Oratorio style. And the process for each of those works today, first I will discuss their historical context, and then we'll get closer to the actual music. We'll look at the text, the form, the writing style, and performing forces in each of those works. And of course, you guessed it, if we talk about Schütz, and if I'm giving the presentation, well, we got to talk about rhetorical examples found in the music. Rhetorik auf Deutsch, yeah? And of course, I will always have that black screen when it comes to make it very, very obvious that we're discussing rhetoric examples for each of the works. So first of all, as I was just talking about, oratorios, passion, or historie? Well, we must understand the terminology. In Germany, there's a long history, historie, actually in German, they say, a tradition. It comes from the Latin historia, and historiae would be the plural. And what is it? It's basically a broad musical genre that is based on a story from the gospel. You guessed it, the most popular story is the story of Jesus, but St. John the Baptist as well, and other stories of the New Testament can be found as historia. All of the text obviously is coming from the gospel, except what we call the exordio and the conclusio, which is the opening and the closing of those oratorios or historia. And when I said that the most common story is the story of Jesus, specifically, even more, it's the story of the Passion. And we have usually two main compositional style, one that is responsorial, where we have often a narrative from the evangelist that is mainly chanted, and then the other groups are answering that would be called responsorial, or through composed, mainly influenced by the motet, I would say, where the groups are through composed, not answering each other, but have duets, trios, and then they get through the text through composed in the motet style. As well, we must understand that Schütz was influenced by people before him. As I explained, there's a long history of the historie in Germany. And here are some salient composers that use the style: Johann Walter, Nikolaus Raustus, Leonard Lechner, Christoph de Mancius, and of course, Antonio Scandello, very important. Why? Because he was himself at the court in Dresden from 1517, these are the dates of his life, but he was at the court for many years, and Schütz had access to his works. And that's important because often he will just copy word for word the libretto of a lot of those oratorios. As well, another big influence, as I mentioned from his trips in Italy, is the Venetian school. We see that first in the antiphony, where he's going to write for different groups answering each other, or double chorus, but specifically in the spatiality. It's not just to have different groups that answer each other, it's where you place those groups in the church. And we're going to see an example very shortly. Of course, the sense of drama is something very important that came from Italy, and instrumentation too. I was reading that on his 2 trips in Italy and other places in Europe, not only would he bring back the style, but he would bring back actual instruments that he would encounter on his trips. So let's dig into them, those 6 narrative works, a closer look, and we will proceed today chronologically. The first one, called the Resurrection Historie, some people call it the Easter Oratorio, is an, as I said, early work with a very, very long title. You have it just here in front of you. I will not dare to pronounce that, but I will refer to it as the Resurrection Historie. It's much faster. About the context, well, it was written for the Easter celebration of 1623 in Dresden. And in terms of historical context, this work comes after the Psalmen Davids of 1619. And why do I mention that? Is that this is a very big piece. It's 26 psalms setting, written in the Venetian style of Gabrielli. So feast of grandeur, brilliance, antiphony, name it, it's all there. And often when we think of Schütz, we don't think of the 6 narrative works I'm talking about today. We think of the Psalmen Davids. We think of Musikalische Exequien, pardon, sorry. Or we think maybe of the Geistliche Chormusik, right? That's another big one we think. So I mention it because this kind of feast of grandeur, as I was saying, can be found a little bit into the Resurrection Oratorio. The intent of the work was the edification of princely chapels. And this is important too, because it means that you must have, at the time, qualified musicians for a successful performance. So the composer thought it was important to mention into the preface of the work. And he will do that for other works as well. Influences of Scandello I was mentioning, and Rostius, because he's using the same libretto. We are talking here about a 50-minute work, so quite long actually. And the narrative is harmonized from the 4 Gospels, and it focuses as well only on the resurrection moment of the Easter story. We could have had like glimpses of the Passion before, but we don't. And so it's really just before the resurrection, the actual resurrection, and the reaction from Mary Magdalena and the disciples. So we have 2 main groups in the work. First, an evangelist, and nothing less than 4 viola da gamba and continuo if available. And talking about spatiality, I was just mentioning, this group is meant to be visible. And he says that in the score. Please put this group at the organ chancel so people can see them. Evangelist giving a story, and 4 viola da gamba and continuo. The other characters, right? Jesus, the angels, Mary Magdalena, and so on, with continuo are supposed to be hidden behind a veil somewhere else in the church. So spatiality, placed in different positions. So the evangelist is singing with recitation tones that is definitely close to chant, and it constitutes most of the work. I wanted to give you an example of that. It's quite unique to have the viols, the viola da gamba that accompany, because he says in the score, they should play in an improvisatory manner, and you can hear the improvise a little bit. Let's listen.
Aber Maria Magdalena also läuft, wie gesagt, kommt sie zu Simon Petro und zu dem anderen Jünger, welchen Jesus lieb hatte, und spricht zu ihnen.
It's beautiful. It's almost like this choir of strings right behind that support the narration, the evangelist. All the other characters are set polyphonically as duets, mainly duets. Most of it is duets, but we have a few trios as well. And it's written in 3rd, or the inversion in 6th, or even if it's a trio in faux bourdon. Sometimes it's written in imitation style. And I must say that's where we find most examples of the rhetoric, and we're going to see just shortly. Both groups are in tension as well musically, in opposition, if you will, right? From the evangelist, recitation, chant-like with the viola da gamba. And then we have the opposite, which is much more alive in the drama, from the other characters, telling us the story and how they react to the story. So on one side, stile antico, almost, and then the other side, we have the Italian seconda pratica. The course has a very limited role, only 3 things: the opening, exordio, the middle, when we have the actual resurrection, and as well in the closing. I thought I would give a quick example of that opening, the exordio. Voila, just a few bars. We must move on. So talking about rhetorical examples, let's look at one we can encounter in the music. We have a case of gradatio, which is what? A sequence of notes in 2 voices moving in ascending or descending in parallel motion. So here's an example. We have the 2 angels, well, the 2 men at the tomb, but we know they represent the angels, that say, "Why look ye here for the living one?" And here's a gradatio, right? They are together in thirds, and they repeat, "Was suchet ihr den Lebendigen? Was suchet ihr den Lebendigen? Was suchet ihr?" And you can see a gradatio, and they repeat it, and it goes up, up, up. Let's listen to the example.
Was suchet ihr den Lebendigen? Was suchet ihr den Lebendigen? Was suchet ihr den Lebendigen? Was suchet ihr den Lebendigen bei den Toten? Er ist nicht hier, er ist nicht hier, er ist nicht hier, er ist nicht hier.
And as you can see, it continues like that, right? So there's more than one gradatio, but I just wanted to give you the first one. Another example of rhetoric we have in the piece is actually this is one of the most common one we find in Baroque music, which is pathopoeia. It's a musical passage which seeks to arouse a passionate affection through chromaticism or some other means. So here's an example where Maria Magdalena gets to the tomb and she sees that Jesus is gone. He has risen from the dead. And she says, she thinks somebody stole the body. So she says, my Lord and Master hath been taken from the sepulchre. And we have a pathopoeia. Look at the chromaticism happening. We have this here as a duet. So someone else is singing with Maria. And we can see the angst, right? From where is he? He's not there. So chromaticism building up. Let's listen. Voila, for the example. We move on to the second work already, the 7 words of Christ, die 7 Worte Jesu Christi am Kreuz. This work was written in 1645, and now we have a big jump. So we go basically at the age of 60, and most of the remaining works today will be as well in the older age of the composer. At this point, he already served 30 years at the Dresden court, and he decides, he thinks he's ready after 30 years of good service, let's retire. But it would be not knowing the first elector of the Dresden court, which is Johann George I, who will, of course, deny that request. And I must say, the many requests that the composer will have constantly, no, you cannot retire. No, no, no. And it's going to go back and forth like this. The intent of the work is unknown. We don't know why he composed this most beautiful work, which is probably the most popular or known of the 6 presented today. As well, he's at the height of his compositional powers at this point. He's written in different style. He had done even one opera that is lost, unfortunately, Daphne. He's written madrigals and so on, and many motes. So he feels very comfortable, and we can see that the writing is exceptional. It's the only work that he will not label as in historie, but it relates closely to the styles, as we will see. Why? Well, the text, like any historia, is coming from the 4 Gospels. This is what we call harmonized from the 4 Gospels. The Introitus and the Conclusio come from the choral hymn Da Jesu am den Kreuze stund by Johann Burschenstein. That's where Schütz will take those first 2 movements, but the rest all coming from the Gospels. So there's only 2 movements for the chorus. Once more, it's not much to sing, and it is an SATTB chorus. Very interestingly, this opening, which is the exordio, right, introitus and conclusio, are matched with another movement, which is a symphonia. So we have the opening at symphonia, and at the end we have the symphonia before the closing. And as you can see, it creates some kind of arch form for the full work. If we look at the arch form, then the keystone right in the middle would be, my God, why have you forsaken me? We're going to discuss those 7 words in a moment that Jesus is saying. So this is scored for 5 unspecified instruments. Schütz does not say which instrument. If you listen to now the recordings we have nowadays, it's often matched with 3 sackbuts, which is the ancestor of the trombones, and 2 violins. The reason for that is that often the sackbut were doubling the voices in a choir, right? Coda parte. There's an old tradition of that. And the violins, why? Well, it's for the halo effect when Jesus is speaking, something that you can probably make a connection with Bach's Passion, right? When the Christ appears to speak, we have this kind of royal appearing of the string to support the talking. But a quick note about that. Always the scholar says that we should be careful not to make a complete comparison with Bach. Why? It was meant at the time often just to differentiate one character from another. Why? Because often one singer, the bass, let's say Jesus, could be as well Peter. So the same person is singing 2 different characters. So to help to differentiate 2 characters, you would add the strings. This is a much shorter work. We're talking about 20 minutes, and we have only 3 main characters, Jesus and the 2 criminals next to him on the cross. we have a very strong devotional character throughout. For example, we have this beautiful E minor that opens and closes every movement. Sometimes we finish in the G major relative, but mainly it's that sense of E minor that prevails the whole time. And Matheson, the great rhetorician, said that this key, we can label it as pensée profonde, trouble et tristesse, mais de telle manière qu'on espère la consolation. Some think that we feel very strongly in the piece. The most elaborate musical moments, and you guessed it, rhetorical moments, can be found in the 7 words of Jesus. Not so much in the recitatives, but mainly when Jesus is speaking. So let's look at that. First, let's look at a case of what we call interrogatio, which is to finish a musical phrase with a raising note to portray what? The human speech raising the voice. If I ask a question, I raise my voice, right? Are you watching my presentation? I raise my voice. So musically, we just finish making sure that the line goes up. So we have a beautiful case here when Jesus says, I believe this is the 4th word. Yes, this is the 4th word of the story. And Jesus who says, why have you forsaken me? Question mark. Let's look at the line. Raising with a beautiful Picardy third. Question mark, finishing by going up. Another example, and this one is very strong, suspiratio, which is a musical expression of a sigh through what? A rest, not music, but a rest. Where can we find this sigh? We can see it clearly at the cross where the Christ is almost dead, and he says the very famous phrase, it is finished. Es ist vollbracht. And look carefully here. Look at those rests. He's gasping for air. It is finished. So it is finished. And we can see those suspiratio, those rests. Let's listen.
Es ist vollbracht.
Voila, for the case of a suspiratio. We go on to the 3rd piece, the Christmas historia. Once more, like the resurrection historia, we have quite a long title that I will just leave that for your own pleasure. Historical context again, well, finally, that sounds a little bit mean to say, but the elector, the first, Johann George, he dies in 1656, which means that Schütz is finally allowed to retire. He is now a senior Kapellmeister, which means that he will still work with the chapel, but much less. He will only write for the big events. He will be replaced by Giovanni Bontempi and Vincenzo Alberici. So at the age of 79 years old, in 1664, he will publish many pieces in which we find the Christmas Historia. He will, however, only publish the recitatives and not the elaborate concerted movements, which are, as we will see, the most interesting, for fear of poor performance. Once more, he intends this for princely chapels, where he says he wants to make sure that they have enough of a big orchestra and good soloists and good choir to perform his music. But nowadays, we're lucky to have it all. For example, we're going to talk about Spitta, who published the complete works. He only published those recitatives. But nowadays, if you buy the Christmas Historia, you will have everything, all those concerted, we're going to see the intermedium, everything is in the score, because we found those scores in Sweden and Berlin. So this is now, Christmas time. So we have a beautiful pastoral key of F major, right? F major, the shepherds in the fields, it's all connected. 10 movements linked by the recitatives of the evangelists. Out of those 10 movements, we have once more the opening, exordio, with the chorus, and we have the conclusio, and we have what we call the 8 solo pieces that are labeled I'm missing an E, intermedium, I'll fix that. It is based on the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, so only 2 Gospels this time. And we have the usual characters of the Christmas story that the angels, the shepherds, wise men, high priests, and so on. The recitatives are close to chants by moment, but not exclusively. He's sometimes using a more Baroque way of writing a recitative, if you will, but sometimes he goes back to chant. Contrastingly, the intermedia, plural, the 8 of them, are very exuberant and super varied in their craft. We have in them canons, ritornellos, fugue, ostinato, free counterpoints, right? So once more, he's having some kind of musical tension between the two styles. Vocal forces as well are varied. For example, that's a really good example. We're not going to listen, but you should. The intermedium number 5 is asking for no less than 4 basses in divisi to depict what? Well, the high priest in the story. Most rhetorical figures can be found in the duos and trios of the 8 intermedia. So let's look at one. Hypotyposis, which is a vivid musical representation of images found in the accompanying text. You would probably know it as what we call tone painting. This one needs a little bit of explanation because there's a lot of things going on. What is the hypotyposis happening? Well, the tone painting is very easy to see. Look at my arrow going through here. We can see the angels coming down from heaven to the shepherds, using what? Of course, the flute, and not just any flute, the recorders. And when they play, they create all sorts of other rhetorical figures that I'm not going to spend too much time on, but we have a case of anaphora and a repetition in the beginning that leads into a gradatio, which we talked about, right? The same motif that repeats, going up or down. In that case, it's going down. And then we have some imitation at the same time. Let's listen first to this image of the angels coming down, and after that, we'll listen to the shepherds that answer to that. And we can see going down. Now let's go up. Here are the shepherds singing in answering the angels. So you can see that the subject is the same, but now it's going up. And they are saying, let us now go even unto Bethlehem. Now, maybe as you were listening to this, you thought, that sounds very familiar. I hope you thought it was the case. Why don't we look at the same text from another composer that you know, Mr. Bach, in his own Christmas oratorio. He's using almost the same thing. Lasset uns nun gehen, the same text, is going up and down, depicting the shepherds that are going to Bethlehem and is starting to be on the move. And Bach is using the same motif from the flute. You see that? The flute descending, and we have an augmentation in the bass going up. All sorts of rhetorical moments that are very, very similar to Schütz. I'll stop here. But maybe you wonder, now that I've started to talk about Bach, Lasset uns, we can think of something else that he's using. Yes, you guessed it. In his Passion, again, using a very similar motif. Lasset uns nicht. But now it's completely different because we're in a Passion. But look at the counter subject, how similar this is to the shepherds, not of his Christmas oratorio, but again, of Schütz before him. Let's listen. We'll stop here, but it was just to show you how the influence of Schütz was transferred as well to Mr. Bach. Okay, let's get to the 3 Passion historie, plural. I will treat them together now, not individually. That's why I wrote here the history of the suffering and death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ after the Gospel of St. Matthew, St. Luke, and St. John. We first thought that he wrote as well as St. Mark, but it was falsely attributed to him. It was written towards the end of his life. Now he's 79 and even 80 years old. St. John will be written first in 1665, and he will write St. Matthew and St. Luke in 1666. All 3 settings were presented a few days from each other in 1666. So 2 weeks before Sunday, called the Judica Sunday, 1 week before the Palm Sunday, and of course on the Good Friday, just 3 days before Easter. That's where all three passions were presented. Now, the big thing about that I want you to remember about it is that all three were written in without any instrument, so completely solo and a cappella. Why is that? Well, one reason is to answer Johann George, the elector, but his son now, right? George I died, so Johann George II, which was not favorable to instruments during Easter and during Lent before that, he would silence all the instrument of the Holy Week. Sorry, I said Easter, I meant Lent and just the Holy Week. So I decided to just to show it to you visually. This is big. Most of those passions are written in chant. So not just a narration like a recitativo style, no, chant style. He's really using, and even the way he wrote the notes, they're written with neumes in chant. And not only is it in chant, he's not reusing the same chant melodies at all for any of the passions. Imagine you need to write new chant lines. And what does that mean? Well, let's look. The three passions totaled 2.5 hours of music that were just 2 weeks from each other. 2.5 hours of music in which we have 2 hours of chant. So only 20% are left for the many turbe choruses that we have in the passions, and they have between 10 to 14 turba choruses, and as well for the exordio and the conclusio. So do you see how much chant there are in those three passions? Talking about the form now, that well, the chants on one side, they reflect a practice of an older century, way before Schütz. But on the other side, the turba chorus is a display a composer completely rooted in his own century. And all is connected in an a cappella setting where he will finish every choruses or every chant line on the same note as the next one, so that everything can be connected a cappella for the whole duration. The longest of all the three setting is the Matthew. Why is that? Well, it reflects the longest story we have in the gospel. And most rhetorical elements, but not all, can be found in the turba choruses. However, I must stop here and take a moment to say that the chant that he's using, he's stretching the style very far. For example, he's going to use chromaticism, modulations, right? He will elongate as well some notes more in the chant for certain words to have some kind of rhetorical thing going on too. So let's look at how he's stretching the boundaries of chant. Let's look at Judas, where he's looking to make a profit and he says, "What will ye give me and I will deliver him to you," from the St. Matthew Passion. Listen how he's repeating the line and he's going up and modulates as he says it.
Was wollt ihr mir geben? Was wollt ihr mir geben? Ich will ihn euch verraten.
So do you see, for just chant, it's quite more than just chant as you would imagine it. So he's adding drama to the chant. Let's look at an example again. This one's a bit hard. Epizoixis, which is what? An immediate and emphatic repetition of a word, note, motif, or phrase. And this one is a bit more complex. You can see on the image, there's a lot of things going on. But this one comes from the St. John Passion, where the crowd, it's a turba chorus, says, scans, Kreuzige, Kreuzige, crucify him. Well, we have 3 syllables in German, right? Kreuzige. And he will match that, as you can see, by a 3/4. 3 entrances, because the soprano is at the same time as the bass. So we have 3 entrances that will repeat a line going down 3 times. Goes down 3 times. And they will say 3 times Kreuzige ihn. On top of that, at the end here, where it says to be impulsive, treibend, we must repeat Kreuzige closer to each other 3 times. Kreuzige, Kreuzige, Kreuzige. And that is what I said, my epizoixis. It's happening right here at the end. Let's listen. As you can see, the placement of the voices not together represent the boisterousness of the crowd that is all yelling at the same time to crucify him. Now let's conclude, as I've been talking for quite some time, to briefly, just a quick thing about his legacy. I discussed the works of Bach, but let's look at Brahms later on in the history. The development of scholarly studies on Schütz, I would say, happened mainly in the past 40 years, thanks to scholars such as Joshua Rifkin, Virginia Hancock, Bettina Warwick, and Eva Linfield, just to name a few that really brought forward what we know now about the composer. But still, it started before that. In 1885, we had the release of the complete works from Schütz, prepared by the Bach scholar, Philippe Bourque. And Philippe Bourque was a friend of Brahms, and Brahms was even involved in the process of releasing those works. I'm writing here Brahms as a collector. What do I mean by that is that Brahms loved early music. All his life, he would make friends with other collectors in hope to have access to their library. For example, sometimes we forget, but Clara Schumann, when her husband died, let Brahms have access to the library of her husband. And he helped even organize the library. And he had access to a lot of music from Gabrieli and Schütz from the library. As well, Clara Schumann even offered to Brahms on her trips in Europe, she said to him, every time I encounter new music, I will take the time to copy it and bring it back home for you. Another thing is that when Brahms passed away, he gave all of his, he left all his collection to the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna. And when we had access to that, we saw first that he possessed all the music of Schütz, but that himself, he took the time to copy out some works from Schütz. For example, the Passions, excerpt from the Passion, the Psalmen Davids, and some of the madrigals. So let's look now at a direct case of connection between the two composers. The last two choral pieces from Brahms, the Fest- und Gedenksprüche, opus 109, and the three motets, opus 110. By the way, if you don't know those works, I urge you as well to discover them. We can see many connections to Schütz. First of all, both are antiphonal, written for two mixed choruses. And we see a lot of Baroque elements in them, especially word declamation, tone painting that we talked about, generous use of dissonances, the dissonance that they come from the very thick imitation going on, chordal simplicity as well, cadential hemioas, and so on. But what is striking about it is that he will incorporate those elements while still sounding like Brahms. I thought that maybe we should have an example of that. Let's look at the last movement of the Fest- und Gedenksprüche, where here we have an example of abruptio. An abruptio is a sudden stop in the music with a figure of silence to show two contrasting elements. You can see it right here at letter D before the word das. And the conjunction here, the word that, das, signals a different segment in the phrase on which Brahms wants to bring attention to. So what is the phrase? It says, however, take care and watch your soul, here on Seelewohl, abruptio, the rest, that, das, you do not forget the stories, the things which your eyes have seen. So he brings a great importance to that das, and you can see the chord finishing on A major, and das starts on F major in a chordal style. We can see a very big Schütz moment. Let's listen. It is beautiful, isn't it? So voilà, an example of a connection between Brahms and Schütz. So just to conclude this presentation, thank you for listening. I would like to offer you, well, you know, I think you should know about this recording. It's one of the best out there from the Hillier Ensemble. Actually, it's the Ars Nova Ensemble directed by Paul Hillier. It's the complete narrative works that we discussed about today from Da Capo. It was released in 2011, and most of the excerpts that you heard were taken as well from that recording. Just a few slides about my bibliography. and the second one, but you can find this obviously in the paper. Thanks, danke. Any questions, please feel free to write to me personally at my email, Philippe, 1L, 2 P's, be careful, .bourque@mail.mcgill.ca. Thank you so much for your undivided attention for this presentation of Schütz's 6 narrative works.